Hello and welcome back to the Blockchain.com podcast. My name is Garrick Heilman. I'm the head of research at Blockchain.com and a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. Today, I'm joined by Mair, head of U.S. public policy at Blockchain.com. As part of our Crypto Basics mini-series, today we're delving into crypto regulation. By the end of this episode, you'll find out if indeed crypto is regulated, what the current state of regulation is in the USA, and what's ahead for crypto regulation, and much more. Ian, first, welcome to the Blockchain.com podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We do have a standard question we ask all our guests, which is how they earned their first ever money. Do you recall what job or task you did to earn money first in your life?
I believe that would have been mowing my grandfather's lawn when I was probably 7 or 8 years old, which probably not old enough to operate a push mower at that time, but I don't think that's the use of lawnmowers isn't regulated for sure.
Indeed, and maybe at that age it should be. But let's just kick off with this question that comes up still so often. I mean, we're 13 years plus into the existence of Bitcoin, and I still hear this: "Oh, crypto is not regulated." So let's just start with that basic question: is crypto regulated today in countries like the U.S.?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. And the slightly longer answer is that we think it could be much more efficiently and better regulated, but that's part of the importance of engaging with regulators and lawmakers, both at the state and the federal level, which we're very proactive in doing.
Great. So for everyone out there, yes, crypto is regulated. And who does the regulation? Who are some of the main players at the regulatory table in the U.S.?
So it's interesting because at the state level, you could make the argument, and a lot of people do say that it's most directly regulated by the state money transmission licensing regime, where you need to obtain what's called an MTL license to operate in a given state. We are in the process of gathering all of those. We still don't have all of them, but we'll get there. At the federal level, it's sort of divided. Generally, people think between the SEC and the CFTC, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. There is some kind of debate about there's a lot of debate, frankly, actually, about what falls under whose jurisdiction, and there's a frequent butting of heads on the federal level of that. But it's not just those two agencies. The Department of the Treasury has a huge role to play. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is kind of Treasury's enforcement division, plays a huge role. And the IRS has also been quite active in issuing guidance over the years, although we're not enamored with much of the guidance that's come out of there, because one of the problems with the federal regulatory regime is that the SEC says certain aspects are securities, the CFTC says certain aspects are commodities, the IRS says it's property. It's just really kind of a jurisdictional butting of heads that makes compliance very difficult at the federal level in the US.
And you mentioned FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is under the US Treasury Department. And I believe that may have been the first federal agency to actually issue any kind of formal regulatory guidance all the way back in 2013. So coming up on almost 10 years ago, we've had some form of regulation of crypto. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. And that actually guidance was a direct result of Senator Tom Carper from Delaware was actually the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee at the time. And he held the first ever congressional hearing on cryptocurrency. And I believe it was November 2013, and it was called Beyond Silk Road. And that was kind of the first time that it really sort of hit the radar for both lawmakers and regulators at the federal level in the US. So I always kind of point people back to say it was Senator Carper and his very senior staff at the time were the ones who really kind of kickstarted the federal discussion in the United States.
Yep. And one other thing that comes up around the question of regulation is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing for crypto? I think the FinCEN Guidance from 2013 is an interesting case study or data point on this question, because it did actually, many thought, lead to the price of Bitcoin and crypto generally to rally. And I wonder if we could just kind of briefly touch on how balanced, reasonable regulation often can be constructive for the crypto market and for prices.
Right, absolutely. I mean, and I always like to, my background beyond crypto is in the multi-client lobbying and consulting space. And I always like to, people frequently say that crypto today is much like the internet was in the 90s, but I like to take it even further back than that and say look at telecom in the 1970s, look at railroads in the late 19th century. I mean, these industries would not have flourished without a, healthy and well-balanced regulatory regime. It's just, and, I mean, businesses hate uncertainty, and the way you get rid of uncertainty is by, having predictable rules of the road. So, I mean, I'm in complete agreement, and I think it's kind of crypto's turn to the plate to get some sort of comprehensive regulatory regime in place.
Yes. Now, regulation isn't always a positive. We've seen some examples of countries, going, to quite extreme lengths to regulate or even ban crypto to a degree. And I wondered if you could kind of touch on some of those countries and who's doing that.
Sure. Well, the one that's top of mind for most people is probably China, which I believe it was it the sixth time, Garrick? I think it took them to several attempts to finally get sort of a ban to stick, and that was sort of focused on mining operations.
Yes.
But that sort of tells you about the staying power of this technology, is that if a government with the level of control that the Chinese government has took them 6 attempts to get a ban right, and even then you could make the argument, I think, that they didn't get it right. But there's also a bit of a silver lining in that there's a chance to really address some of the energy use and environmental impact concerns, because China just does not prioritize clean energy use whatsoever. And a lot of those mining interests that were banned from China came here, where, Bitcoin mining is only profitable insofar as you're not spending a huge amount of your resources on energy costs, and renewable energy is more and more becoming the cheapest and most reliable sources of energy in the United States. So I think that's kind of the silver lining of the China ban. But the other restricted countries are kind of what you would expect, countries that, where governments have an incredible degree of control and freedom is not necessarily a priority or even on the table. So Iran, North Korea, some of the other more, I think I've heard the term in the past, non-aligned states. But it's generally, kind of a lot, it tracks pretty much with what you would think in terms of countries that don't allow great economic or social freedom.
Yep. And I think another important point to make is we talk about countries that have gone as far as China has in banning, most, if not all of, kind of crypto activity. We're talking about a relatively small number of countries globally. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it could be 10 or fewer that have gone to those lengths, I believe. But let's turn back to the U.S. market. There's so much attention and focus placed on the U.S. regulatory environment. Why is that?
The world sort of still follows the U.S.'s financial example, right? I mean, we still have some of the biggest and strongest capital markets in the world. The dollar is still the world's reserve currency. And this is, it's interesting because if you sort of look at the macro picture, the institutional interest has kind of arrived. I was talking to some of our institutional team the other day, and they said within 2 or 3 years, they think most of the big financial players are going to have, if they don't already, have some exposure to the space. And these are really sophisticated entities who, kind of getting back to our previous point, depend on regulatory clarity to be able to serve themselves and their customers. So they're not going to really jump in with both feet until that is settled here. And I think there's an understanding of this. I mean, we've seen a lot of recent developments kind of on the federal level, but I think it's kind of boils down to the US markets are still so key to global markets, and people still follow the United States lead on issues.
Yep, and wanting to remain in alignment with the U.S. regulatory posture because of how integrated markets are with the U.S. system.
Yep, exactly.
So let's talk about the current state of regulation in the U.S. We had the Biden administration, the White House, of course, announced something quite significant earlier this year. What is kind of the current picture here in the U.S.?
Yeah, so the executive orders kind of top of mind for most people here in Washington, and for good reason, obviously. And my joke is that I've been waiting, I've been in crypto policy for almost a decade now, and I've been waiting for the real exercise to begin for about a decade. So I think, some people weren't thrilled with everything the executive order did and said. It's also important to remember that the executive order itself did not create or alter any policy. It's directing agencies to study where they think they have gaps in their ability to regulate cryptocurrency. So the first batch of reports are due in June. The second are due in September. So you'll start to see more opportunities for public input around June and September. And I always like to remind people too that these deadlines frequently slip, and especially given geopolitical events right now, don't be surprised if we don't see those reports until a little later than their due dates.
Yep.
But it's a really net positive, I think, because it's, like I said, I would always prefer a whole of government approach where possible. And it's, I would much rather have this than each little individual agency working in its own silos, which is kind of what it's been to date, and which is where you end up with kind of the messy federal patchwork.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's hone in on some of the key areas of interest that U.S. regulators are looking at. Just we can go through these in no particular order, but what are kind of the hot topics, most pressing areas in crypto that are attracting regulatory interest?
The one that's really interesting, and I hate to beat a dead horse, but it's the very first RFI that came out of the executive order was about the energy impacts of mining. So, I mean, obviously the Democratic Party is in power and they're going to always prioritize climate, addressing climate change and the use of green energy where possible. So that just kind of tells you where that falls among the hierarchy of priorities, and that was the very, very first one that came out. There, obviously national security is high up the list as well. There's been a lot of discussion about potential use of crypto and sanctions evasion, even though Treasury and FinCEN continue to say they're not really seeing that in any meaningful capacity. But those are kind of the top two, I think. And there's also a big focus on stable coins, just because they are, I think, both such a potentially revolution in payments technology that, the Federal Reserve is exploring potentially creating something akin to their own. But it's also a key on-ramp and off-ramp to the system. And I think that's sort of where regulators are looking to say, we would, they want to get their hands around it a little more, where they don't, that's kind of a perfect example of something that they feel like they maybe don't have all the tools they need to regulate right now. So that'll be interesting to see. And the President's Working Group on Financial Markets actually issued a report last November that basically said as such that, we're still getting our hands around this. It also said they'd feel a little more comfortable if there was some degree of deposit insurance involved, although they didn't prescribe whether that's a bank partnership or if stablecoin issuers need to go out and get their own charters. But so those are kind of the three sort of top of mind issues right now, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And then two others that get mentioned, DeFi or decentralized finance. The idea that, boy, there isn't a headquarters and a CEO atop some of these protocols that allow for borrowing and lending or exchange of crypto assets. I think really that non-hierarchical nature of DeFi certainly challenges many regulators, and then non-custodial wallets as well are a perennial topic.
Yeah, and on DeFi, it's interesting because, I always like to say that if this executive order means that we're in the top of the first inning, to use a baseball analogy, in federal crypto policy, I think DeFi, you're probably still in the pregame warmups, just because that's really just sort of now in the last few months starting to come on the scene, where one of the SEC commissioners wrote a very kind of impassioned defense of it, saying this has potential opportunity, but it also has real potential threats. I mean, you don't want people just off the street who have no understanding of what they're investing in, throwing their obviously retirement savings into a DeFi protocol. That wouldn't be good. And actually also at a recent Senate Banking Committee hearing, some senior Senate Democrats for the first time ever were discussing DeFi protocols and mixers. And it was the first time I'd ever heard very senior lawmakers sort of talking about those specific protocols and technologies. So that's just now sort of coming onto the radar, I think. And as far as non-custodial wallets go, there was a sort of so-called midnight rulemaking attempt at the very end of the Trump administration that was driven by then Secretary Steve Mnuchin that would have pretty much been a unilateral ban or made compliance impossible, so sort of a backdoor ban on non-custodial wallets. And Treasury, when they published their regulatory agenda earlier this year, that was still on the agenda, but just the fact that it's there doesn't mean it's coming anytime soon. We unfortunately don't have a lot of visibility into if or even when. I mean, just because it's on the agenda doesn't mean it's ever actually going to come up. But that is definitely still on the radar as well. You're exactly right.
Yep. If some of these terms, by the way, like DeFi and non-custodial wallets are new to you, we're going to link in the show notes to prior podcasts or other written content that explain in more detail what exactly is a non-custodial wallet or DeFi. So look for those links. So let's turn to this question of governments adopting crypto. And we've seen some really noteworthy examples in the last 12 months, probably the most significant one being El Salvador's decision to make crypto legal tender. We've also seen local US mayors talking, like in Miami, about not only taking their salaries in Bitcoin, but also maybe using public funds to invest some of the city treasury funds in Bitcoin. But to talk to us about what happened in El Salvador. What does it mean for Bitcoin to be legal tender?
I mean, it's maybe I'm too deep in the weeds to say that I think it's kind of self-explanatory, but I mean, it means it has parity with whatever the national currency previously was. And it's interesting because I know Peter Smith, our CEO, was on stage last week at Emerge Americas, and he spoke kind of very eloquently about saying that the El Salvador legal tender is a very interesting experiment, but he wasn't a huge fan of the compulsory nature of it, and thought that sort of ran contrary to some of the foundational principles of Bitcoin, which is financial freedom, right? So it's an interesting question, just because if you're mandating that it must be accepted, is that kind of fulfilling the original mission, right?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting to note that both at a national level, in the case of El Salvador, and there's rumors and some work going on, in various corners of government and other Latin American countries, and even I was just reading last night about Central African Republic, maybe possibly looking at exploring adopting Bitcoin, but also at the local level, cities and states. It's really at various levels of government, we're seeing a public sector embrace of crypto, which is generally probably overall pretty constructive for the future of this whole space.
Yeah, and I believe, I'm almost certain actually that I think now just this year, both Colorado and Utah made it so you could pay your taxes in Bitcoin, which is interesting because there was this bit of a workaround involved because they had not modified, to your point about some, localities and municipalities maybe considering holding Bitcoin as an investment, but state governments currently cannot do that, or at least most state governments can't, but they made it so you could pay your taxes in Bitcoin if you so wish, and then they would sell it immediately or convert it to fiat immediately. And there's also, we've had a couple of quite frankly, very funny meetings with a couple of really kind of forward-looking and forward-leaning state legislators who were really bullish on the idea of making it Bitcoin specifically legal tender at the state level in their given home states. And it was kind of news to them because they kept saying, when you talk to state legislators and state regulators in the US, everyone's looking to Wyoming as the lead, and everyone kind of feels like they're behind Wyoming. And I've had a couple of instances where I had to say, well, Senator, what you're proposing is more akin to El Salvador than Wyoming. And they were a little bit taken aback by that.
Well, as we wrap up here and kind of look to the future, we've already talked about the White House executive order and kind of what the roadmap there looks like. We've got the midterm elections coming up in the US. I mean, to me, it's just incredible that crypto has become kind of like one of the issues that politicians now have to, have kind of a position on, and just in terms of the people listening to this podcast and how they can get involved in helping to express their views. I mean, should they be asking their representatives, what's your position on crypto, or what can they do, and what kind of things do you expect beyond the White House executive order in the working group there in the months to come?
Well, as far as engaging elected officials go, I would say absolutely. And a key message that I always tell people is that, congressional and regulatory staff are quite literally maybe the most overworked and underpaid people in the world. So be nice when you reach out to them. There's a lot of calls to arms and people kind of digging into the trenches, but you catch more flies with honey at the end of the day. So, be polite, say, do you have a position? If not, we'd like to help you develop a position. As far as just looking ahead generally, I think you're right that a lot of people, the midterm elections are on a lot of people's minds right now. That's still an open-ended question of, we could potentially be facing a divided government in the next, for the next 2.5 years, wherein there could be complete Republican control of Congress and a Democratic White House. And historically, that's not a very productive legislative or regulatory environment. Although I have been part of Bill, there's a way to thread that needle. So I'm optimistic that, crypto's brightest days are still ahead in terms of legislation and regulation. And there is a way to thread the needle and get legislation and regulation done productively in a divided government.
Yeah, and that might be a good chance to bring into this discussion the fact that there is, room for bipartisanship. We do have people on both sides of the political aisle who are supportive of crypto and blockchain technology, and maybe it's just worth touching on that, because that's, in this era of people criticizing how divided government is and there's no common ground. For many of us, we see crypto as at least having some hope in terms of bipartisanship and the ability to get things done with both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, absolutely. And historically, it's, my line is it's always been more of an easy sell to the Republican side of the aisle, just because it is sort of a, it's a very libertarian ethos. But there are some very senior Democrats who've, gotten off the bench and gotten involved, where Senator Ron Wyden obviously is a very passionate advocate for privacy, which you and I have discussed a little bit in the past. and also open source programming rights, where he's really truly believes that code is speech. So he thinks, if you're trying to say that you cannot code in a certain way, that's equivalent to saying that you cannot speak in a certain way. And another really great one is Senator Cory Booker recently was speaking very eloquently about an opportunity, crypto and the entire space is potentially an opportunity for, families, African American families, minority families who haven't had the opportunity to build generational wealth. This could be a way for them to catch up and potentially do that. And that obviously, we always want to prioritize consumer protection and don't recommend anyone go empty their 401k and invest it in Bitcoin or anything like that. But yeah, I completely agree with you that in the time of really kind of partisan divided government, it's just beginning to sort of turn the page. So that's good. We're ahead of the curve on other issues and other industries.
Excellent. Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Great. Thanks so much, Gary.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you're enjoying our podcast, please rate us and leave a review, as it really helps boost our visibility to more listeners. Also, if you have a topic you'd like to see us cover, please get in touch at the following email address: podcast@blockchain.com. Once again, that's podcast@blockchain.com.